Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining in this morning to this webinar. Thank you for taking a break in your day to join Objects Up Close, Fabricating the Solar System, 19th Century Orreries. This is a virtual lecture hosted by Winterthur Museum, Garden, and Library. I'm Stephanie Bailey. I'm the Manager of Continuing Education at Winterthur. And for those of you who have been logging into this virtual series for some time, you already know that the learning objective of each Objects Up Close presentation is to understand the Winterthur collection through a focused technical or research perspective to inform the broad historical record. Each presentation in the series is given by a graduate fellow of the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture or the Winterthur University of Delaware Program in Art Conservation. The presentations are oftentimes part of current research projects. The perspectives are always fresh and nuanced. This Objects Up Close presentation for November was scheduled, we realized, during the week that we end daylight savings time, when we return our clocks by 1 hour and there's more light in the morning and less in the evening. Daylight saving time actually has no effect on the planets. It's a human-made concept to manipulate our clocks. However, the amount of daylight a planet receives has been a topic of wonder for some time. Today, we're going to explore how, in the 19th century, celestial discoveries were communicated to the public and understood through models of the solar system called orreries. So now I have to just give a few brief Zoom announcements, and this is just so that you can engage to the fullest with the presentation today. This is a Zoom meeting, so you don't have access to your audio, but please, at any time, go ahead and enter any questions or comments into the chat box. I'll be keeping my eye on the chat box while our presenter is speaking. If you're having any sort of technical difficulty, you can, I would recommend that you send your chat box message to just me instead of everyone in the Zoom room today. I'll try and help you as best I can. At the end of the presentation, I will take your comments and questions from the chat box and pose them to our speaker. Now, if you like to have captions during the live presentation, you actually manage that from your own Zoom profile. So go ahead and look at the bottom of your screen and hit that More button. Select Captions and Show Captions. It might take a few seconds, but you'll get the text, the captioning very soon. After the live program, usually within about 48 hours, you will receive an email with the recording of the presentation. Please note, of course, that this presentation is being recorded. So our speaker today is Darby Ronning. She's a second-year master's student in the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture. She received undergraduate degrees in history and statistics from the University of Minnesota, then spent a year teaching English to French middle school students. At Winterthur, she studies objects used in scientific contexts to better understand how everyday people processed new discoveries. Other interests of Darby's include postcards from rural Minnesota, 1970s feminist science fiction, and, incredibly, running half marathons. There's one coming up. After graduating from Winterthur, she hopes to continue pursuing hands-on history education in a library or museum context. And Darby, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to welcome you to my talk today and to speak a little bit about the solar system and orreries. So welcome to Fabricating the Solar System, Orreries and Everyday People. So this is the object that we're going to be looking at today, and it's an orrery. An orrery is a model of the solar system. Was made in 1824 by a school teacher named Joseph C. Hart in New York City. And the first time I saw this model at the Winterthur Museum, Today it lives in the Memorial Library. I was intrigued. Why this object, Hart's Orrery, looks the way that it does. And I'm studying this object in the course of my graduate work. I am a fellow in the Winterthur program in American Material Culture. Um, Here is a photo of me with my lovely cohort on one of our field studies this summer. And in the Winterthur program, we study history through objects. We use objects as primary source evidence, and we interpret objects to talk about American history. So the objects that I'm studying are American orreries from 1780 to 1860. So we'll only be discussing Winterthur's example today, but I wanted to give you all a taste of the wide variety of solar system models made during this time period. Now, the solar system is the same no matter how you model it, but we can see that the modes of representation are very different depending on the goals of the creator and how they are interpreting the solar system. So in my thesis, I have a few guiding questions. How did people imagine the solar system and learn about astronomical discoveries? And how did orreries help people understand the solar system? So I'm using orreries, these models of the solar system, as evidence in answering both of these questions, to especially in regards to everyday people, to non-astronomers, non-scientists, and how their understandings were processed during this time period. So coming back to Hart's Orrery, why does it look like this? It represents a particular moment in astronomical discovery and interpretation. And importantly, it represents one individual, Joseph C. Hart, and his interpretation of the solar system. So just as a quick refresher, this is the way that probably most of you understand the solar system today. We have the sun, 8 planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Now, Hart's orrery and the planets, it does not match the understanding that we have of the solar system today. Notably, there are 11 planets pictured. And that's really what intrigued me about this object is what did we think about the solar system in the 1800s that led to a different representation than one we might make today? And importantly, Hart's orrery was also not the standard of the time period. Here we have Hart's orrery on the left, made in 1824, and on the right we have an orrery made by clockmaker Aaron Willard Jr. In the same time period. His was made in Boston. And so even these two examples made by non-astronomers in urban contexts in the early 1820s look very different. So again, the solar system is the same, but the interpretation is different. And that's really something that I want to dig into today, is why does the object on the left look the way that it does? So to understand why this object looks how it does, we need to understand its maker. Let's turn to the engraved base plate to learn a little bit more. So the base plate is engraved, constructed by Joseph C. Hart for Mr. Maguire's Academy, 1824. Who is Joseph C. Hart? Joseph C. Hart is kind of my historical bestie. He lived from 1798 to 1855. He lived most of his life in New York City, where for a time he ran the mechanic school. And so this was a private school for the children of skilled tradesmen who were part of kind of a proto-union there who made the school. This was a time before widespread public education, and so private academies, private schools were how a lot of students accessed education. Joseph C. Hart also published geography atlases. He was also the curator of the Mechanics Institute. He was involved in a lot of educational efforts. He did a lot of other stuff too. In later years, Joseph C. Hart became a lawyer and ran for New York City office. He wrote a book called The Romance of Yachting. He died in the Canary Islands in 1855, 1 year after being elected or being appointed as an ambassador there. And this man was simply a busybody in the papers. On the right, we see he is leading a forum discussing the very important question, is novel reading beneficial? And this is just a small sample of all of the things that I've seen Joseph Hart write about, be involved in the newspapers. The really fantastic thing is he always signed his name Joseph C. Hart, which made researching him simply a breeze. One of the other people that I'm researching, his name was John Locke, not the philosopher. He was an American educator from Ohio. So having a unique name was really quite a treat. So how did Joseph C. Hart imagine the solar system? Let's look at what the state of astronomical discovery was in the 1820s. So since antiquity, people have understood that Mercury, Venus, Earth, the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn were part of the solar system. And by the 17th century, heliocentrism, the sun-centered solar system, was accepted by most scientists. And there were discoveries of 4 moons of Jupiter and 5 moons of Saturn. So that's the 17th century. There's a bit of a pause. And in 1781, we start to see more astronomical, more solar system discoveries. 1781, William Herschel discovered Uranus. Quickly afterwards, he discovers more moons of Uranus and Saturn. And then at the turn of the century, we see some more discoveries that are today known as asteroids. But right now, I'd like to focus on these discoveries of Uranus. And you'll see that the moons discovered in 1797 have a little asterisk by them. These are often called Uranus's spurious moons. William Herschel announced a discovery of these 4 moons, and they were accepted as scientific fact for a long time until the 1850s when later discoveries disproved these 4 moons. But here in Hart's orrery, Uranus has 6 moons. Now, this makes sense. His model was made in 1824, and the discoveries from the 1850s wouldn't have had anything, Hart wouldn't have known about them. They happened afterwards. Looking at some of the textual sources that William Hart would have had access to, all of the models of Uranus, sometimes depicted with an H, sometimes the planet was called Herschel, all of the models show Uranus with 6 moons. They were fully accepted. But something that I find interesting is that a lot of modern timelines that discuss astronomical discovery kind of gloss over these 4 moons altogether. We see a timeline here from NASA that talks about the discovery of Uranus in 1781, and then says, 4 moons were discovered from 1787 to 1851, never really talking about these additional 4 that were spurious, that were later disproven. And so I think that really speaks to the way that sometimes when looking back on scientific discovery, the narrative, the timeline can be a bit flattened and simplified. And that makes a lot of sense. Many discoveries were later disproven, and we can't always talk about them all. But just something to keep in mind is that timelines of scientific discovery, of astronomical discovery, might not accurately reflect how people living through these discoveries experienced them. This timeline would be very confusing to someone living in 1824. They would say, where are the 4 other moons? So with that example in mind, I would like to talk about these 4 objects between Mars and Jupiter. We see Mars, the little red one, and then we see Jupiter. It has 4 moons. One of them is on the other side there. So coming back to our astronomical discovery timeline, we see 1801 through 1807, we see the discovery of these 4 celestial bodies. And I write today they are known as asteroids. Today, these 4 objects live in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. But during the early 1800s, there wasn't always agreement as to how to interpret these objects. Of course, they orbit the sun. So many people consider them to be primary planets on the same status as Uranus, Saturn, the other planets. But they are a little bit strange. These planets are all very small. They're all in the same orbital range. They're all very close to each other. They're very eccentric in that their orbits are very oval shaped. They're not perfect circles. And they're also very inclined. They're tilted at an angle. So all of these facts together lead to some discrepancies, some uncertainties in the way that sources discuss these objects. even into the 1820s, decades after they were initially discovered. Asteroids, are they planets? Should they be included in models of the solar system? How are these objects treated during the 1820s? So here I have an example that I think really encapsulates how this debate was playing out. Here we have a bit of a correction at the start of a textbook called Elements of Astronomy. And we see that even the author of one singular author is kind of having a debate with himself over what do these objects mean. They were initially not reckoned as primary planets, but were called asteroids. However, the author says that there appeared to be no good reason for this classification and made some edits that were, of course, missed in one particular case. So this is just a great encapsulation. I was so excited when I found this. It felt like a smoking gun as to how the asteroids were treated, that even one person might not have a totally fleshed out idea as to what these objects signified. And we can see this uncertainty showing up in different diagrams of the asteroids. This example from 1807 doesn't include asteroids at all. The space between Mars and Jupiter, blank. However, this isn't universal. This more technically geared diagram from a philosophical and mathematical dictionary shows the four asteroids in beautiful concentric orbits, a little bit smaller than all of the other planets, perfectly nestled between Mars and Jupiter. And then other sources, such as this textbook, A Grammar of Astronomy, shows the asteroids as about the same size as other planets, with overlapping orbits, as was understood. Their orbits had been calculated, and they were known to overlap a bit, but basically on the same stage as the rest of the planets. Now, interestingly, we know that Joseph C. Hart read this book. He reviewed it very favorably. Now, this review comes after his orrery was made. Hart made his orrery in 1824, and this review is from 1827, but it does represent the kinds of sources that Joseph C. Hart was reading, and the sources that he was taking in to understand the solar system. So Hart read sources that considered asteroids to be part of the solar system. Now, the sources that he was reading showed the asteroids with overlapping orbits as they exist in the solar system. But when making a physical model, sometimes you have to make compromises. There are physical limitations. It would have been very difficult for Hart to model his orrery, showing how the orbits, the weird looking orbits of these asteroids actually looked. And so here we see him making compromises to include the asteroids at all. And this leads us to our next logical question. Why would Joseph C. Hart make an orrery in the first place? What's his motivation? Why is he doing this? And I think we get a hint from the very same book that he reviewed positively, A Grammar of Astronomy, the same book with the diagram of the solar system with the overlapping asteroids. So this book that he reviewed positively, it has an image of what most commercially available orreries looked like. We see this tabletop model with pretty intricate gear work, and notably, not including the asteroids. It has the planets Mercury through Uranus, no asteroids at all. So I'm theorizing that if Hart was reading materials that portrayed the asteroids as planets, but he couldn't find a commercially available orrery that reflected his own mental model of the solar system, he may have wanted to make his own orrery to reflect what he thought about the solar system to use in teaching for his students. So this brings us to Hart's students and how orreries were used in teaching. How was this orrery used? Now, I mentioned Joseph C. Hart as a bit of a newspaper busybody, and this works really well to my favor as a researcher. When Hart was the principal of his mechanics school, he led yearly public examinations for his students, kind of as an advertisement for his school and his abilities as an educator. And with each of these examinations come anonymous reviews by an observer just praising the school and Mr. Hart, the instructor, who unites uncommon talent and a correct manner of communication far superior to his years. So I think it's safe to say that these anonymous reviews are written by Joseph C. Hart himself. Um, and that's fantastic for me because we can get a little bit of an insight into Hart's motivations for creating his orrery. So let's look at one review here, written after Hart's orrery was used at one of his school examinations. And it praises the use of the orrery of this model of the solar system by conveying instruction through the means of sensible objects. So this is sensible in the terms of like tactile, like you can touch the object. You're learning through interacting with a model of the solar system. And it says that the young mind must catch instantaneously a correct idea of the solar system. So we're seeing Hart talking about this orrery as an educational object that's giving students knowledge that they wouldn't be able to get through just reading or listening. It's through interacting with this model that they're understanding the solar system. And he also talks about how his orrery was democratic. It's for the people. He compares it to other types of orreries that are better for small groups that have that complicated gear work that is liable to get out of order. And the simplicity of his orrery is really it's a selling point. He's Large groups of students can use it, children can use it without worrying about messing up the fancy gear work, and it's a lot less expensive than the other orreries. So just as a reminder, this is what Hart is comparing his orrery to, these fancier models that might not be suited for the use of children. Um, so yes, coming back to the engraved base plate, let's think about Mr. McGuire's Academy. So I've identified Mr. McGuire's Academy as the Chatham Seminary, led by Edward McGuire in New York City. Now, this is seminary in the terms of like just an educational academy, not really with a religious connotation. But we see this advertisement for the Chatham Seminary saying that they teach astronomy with the celestial globe and orrery. So here we have Edward McGuire's Academy using the orrery. And something I find really interesting in this example is that astronomy is only part of the male department. And this isn't universal. Some of the orreries that I've studied were used in girls' schools in particular. And astronomy was not always a gendered subject. So that's a question that I want to dig into further. Why is it only for the boys at this school? But something about Edward McGuire is he died in 1826, which of course is tragic for his school. Models of the solar system, they were very common in the early 1800s as teaching tools. But these models, they were used to bits. They didn't survive the handling of classroom students all day for years on the orrery might be the reason why it still exists today, is it wasn't subjected to years and years of school use. I have tracked down McGuire's will. He didn't mention the orrery in particular, and I'm not entirely sure of the path between 1826 when McGuire died and the 70s when Winterthur acquired the orrery, but I do not believe it was used in a school context in that time. I definitely still have some questions about this object. Why doesn't Earth have a moon? Joseph C. Hart knew that Earth had a moon, but this isn't represented in the model. And that's really something I don't understand why. Something to look into further. Was Saturn replaced at some point? The planet Saturn in the orrery, it's made of a different material and there aren't any moons. So I think it was replaced at some point. I don't exactly know when. Why is the base of this object so elaborately carved of a beautiful mahogany when the planetary part just is not quite as elaborate? Um, I imagine that the base was originally used for another piece of furniture and then repurposed, but I have not tracked down exactly what it would have been used from. And did Hart make other orreries, or is this the only one? There are talks of orreries being in use from at least 1821. Was that the same orrery as this one that was later gifted to Maguire's Academy? I'm not sure. So definitely still some further work to do on this project. But before I end, I would like to bring us back to my thesis questions that I'm talking about. How did people imagine the solar system and learn about astronomical discoveries? And how did orreries help people understand the solar system? So we see in this example that individuals had different interpretations of the solar system. Think back to the different diagrams. They all looked different. They all reflected individuals' slight variations in how they were interpreting and drawing the solar system. And Joseph C. Hart's orrery is different from other models, showing individual interpretations and just individual understandings. The people in the past were not a monolith. It's not just one undifferentiated mass public that's all understanding scientific knowledge in the same way. Everyday individuals had their own intellectual lives and thought of science differently from other people. They were individuals. And how did orreries help people understand the solar system? We can see that they were used in classroom instruction as part of experiential learning, and definitely influenced the students in how Hart's and Maguire students understood the solar system through the use of this orrery. So yes, I would like to give a huge thank you to my advisor, Dr. Catherine Dan Rober, a huge thank you to Stephanie Bailey, who organized this series and this talk, my fellow cohorts in my class who have listened to me talk about the solar system for more than a year, and all Winterthur staff who have been very supportive in this project. Yeah, if you have any further questions or comments that you'd like to discuss with me after this talk is over, my email is here. And yes, I'm open for questions or discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darby. That was amazing. And I really appreciate that you ended your presentation with more questions, introducing us to your project, but also letting us know where your line of thinking is going moving forward as you're completing your thesis. And speaking of questions, you have many of them in the chat box. Yeah. So let me pull them out and we can have a little chat. First of all, thank you for introducing me to the term historical bestie. I liked that. Yeah. So the first question in the chat box is, lack of planarity of this model is interesting compared to other contemporary models. Do you think the model was originally meant to be planar and has it slumped differentially, or did the maker just not care?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So yeah, looking at the orrery, we can see that all of the planets are at different levels. They're not all on the same plane. Um, and I would be really hesitant to use the lack of planarity, as you call it, as evidence because looking at these like iron wires that are supporting all of the planets, there's I, it would be difficult for me to say with certainty that this is originally how they were angled. So I'm not sure if it was originally meant to be planar. Maybe, maybe not. Um, yeah. Additionally, the planets that are connected to the base through these ivory discs, they're movable. And actually, when this orrery first entered Winterthur, the four of the asteroids, they were all at the bottom. They were beyond Uranus. So we're not even really 100% certain that um, this is exactly the right order that Hart intended.
Mm.
Based on all our best research, like yes, there would have been the four asteroids there. But yeah, the exact order, the planarity, that's a great question.
And do the arms, do they rotate all the way around
They
360
do. Well,
like to
they're
actually see
intended
it in
to.
motion?
We
Yeah.
we don't move them like that, but
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
So here's a message that I got in my personal chat. Would Hart have had a funder or a benefactor to compensate for the cost of time and research required to make this?
Um, Not that I know of. He during this time, the early 1820s, he had several jobs, including as a school teacher and also as like a curator of a museum, he called himself. So it might have been through those funds that he was making this object. I don't know of any funders.
So here's a question. We just talked about it a moment ago a little bit. How accurately were these various orreries for representing the solar system? Did they accurately predict what planets would be visible and how they moved through the sky? In other words, were they really replicating the motion of the planets mechanically as an object?
I am so glad you asked that question because it shows up in a lot of the literature around orreries, even during the time period. William Herschel, his son John Herschel, hated orreries. He called them mere toys. He said they don't accurately represent the heavens. Um, I have seen a textbook calling orreries, quote, faint illustrations of what the solar system is really like. And there are often like notes saying, hey, an orrery is just giving students a general idea of the solar system, not the size, the relative size, the relative distances between the planets. I read a really interesting book from 1818, made by a botanist who just had some ideas about astronomy. And he said, the orrery is terrible. It doesn't tell you anything about the solar system. I have created an orbitarium with like bent wires at different angles and in ovals to the idea is to give learners a better idea of how the solar system was actually situated. So the inaccuracy of these models was known and discussed, and the most proponents of orreries acknowledged that this is giving students a general idea of the general motions, not exactly what the solar system is.
Got
Yeah,
it.
thank you for that.
Mhm. We're also interested in the mechanics of this piece. Another question here is, did Hart actually make the orrery, or did he commission an instrument maker to fashion the orrery using his Hart's design?
Um, Yes, that's a good question. I believe he would have made it himself, because I think that if he would have commissioned an instrument maker, frankly, it would have been better. The example that I showed from the Chester County History Center was commissioned by the Ohio educator John Locke, who I was talking about. He commissioned a clockmaker to make an orrery by his own design, by his own calculations. Um, Frankly, Hart's orrery is so crude that I believe he would have made it himself.
Interesting. It is crude, but as you pointed out, the difference between the top and the bottom is
It's
really
striking.
noteworthy. Yeah, it
Yeah.
really is. Yeah. Oh. A couple comments in the chat here. Great talk. Thanks. And then one last question. Why is Mars so large compared to the Earth's ball, which seems to be very small?
Yes, that's a great question. And honestly, that's a good area for further research. I'm not entirely sure. It's just another thing that makes this model so strange.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's such a compelling object. I just have to ask, do you know if it was ever on exhibit at Winterthur? It's and it's not in one of the historic rooms, so I'm wondering
It
how this
is.
piece is it okay currently?
It's in the memorial library on the sixth
Ah,
floor.
okay.
So yeah.
Yeah, on the
And to
fifth.
my knowledge, it's never been on display in an exhibit.
Nice.
It was on display in the 1820s at a bookstore in New York City for a time. So I can imagine someone walking down the street and seeing this weird orrery.
Interesting. Huh, interesting. Okay, we have two more questions that just popped in. Um, is oh, I just said two and then came another. So now we have three. Is it possible that the wires were once horizontal? And I can see how
I
Michael is
Yeah,
asking that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's possible.
No, I guess we don't know.
Yeah, that's a good thing to think about.
What was the advantage to producing your own orrery? Was there, in fact, a marketplace for orreries at this time? When would it have made sense to produce your own versus purchasing a commercial example?
Yes, well, I think as I talked about a bit, the commercially available orreries did not include asteroids for the most part. So if someone wanted asteroids in their model, they would have had to DIY. In terms of the marketplace, the big producers of orreries, the biggest one was a company called William Jones, based in England. Um, and so those were fairly expensive in the United States during this time period, and mostly went to colleges and universities, not necessarily like these like academies and schools. Um, yes, there aren't really enough surviving examples to really have like numerical data on how many were produced at home or in the United States versus like imported from England, but um, I imagine cost was a driving factor and the ability to like alter your own.
Sure. Well, thank you, Darby. I love this project for you because it combines your scientific knowledge and interests with your study of material culture. I look forward to hearing more from you in the future as you complete your thesis. Thank you for sharing the project with us up until this point. The final question in the chat box is, can we see the orrery? And the answer to that question is probably. The best way to plan ahead if you're coming to Winterthur to see an object is by checking our online collections database, which will give you information on the accession number, the description of the object, and then usually an update as to where it's located right now. You can also call ahead of time to our visitor services office. And if you give them the accession number, the name of the object, they can give you the most current information as to whether or not an object is on view at that current moment or not. Um, as you might imagine, very frequently objects are pulled from the house for conservation or for study or for other reasons like Yuletide. Um, on November 10th, in just a few days, in fact, um, the self-paced tour of Winterthur is going to be closed to the public so that we can change the house over for Yuletide displays. So something that you might be expecting to see in the house might not be available during that changeover time. We call that changeover. So always call ahead, find out if an object is on view, and remember that we're closed in January and February. We will reopen to the public in March, and at that time, the house is reset. So if something isn't on view during Yuletide, you could come back in March and see it in its usual place in the house. How do you find the accession numbers for items? Go to the online database and it should be listed in that information there. Um, and if you have any specific questions, you can also email me directly. I'm going to put my email in here and I'd be happy to give you the most up-to-date information and even send you to some additional supplemental resources on whatever object it is that you're pursuing. So thanks very much for coming into Objects Up Close today. And thank you to Darby for that excellent presentation. Our next Objects Up Close presentation actually is next week. We have two in November. And we're going to be exploring a needlework piece by Anne Plato. So please come back again. Hope to see you soon, either in the Zoom room or at Winterthur. Thanks all. Take care.
Thank you.